So we're going to start by looking at the architecture of vCenter and all of its components, and how vCenter communicates with ESXi to do things like powering on virtual machines or creating virtual machines or initiating a vMotion, those sorts of things. It's vCenter communicating with ESXi to do stuff. Now, vCenter is composed of a whole bunch of different sets of services. We're also going to have a look in this lesson at those different services so you can kind of get an idea as to some of the different things that vCenter is actually doing. So this is a conceptual drawing of our ESXi hosts down here at the bottom, right? So here we have ESXi running on physical hosts. We can call this vSphere here, but we can be sure that this is ESXi. And that ESXi runs virtual machines. Now, if you wanted to manage an environment without vCenter server here, you'd have to log into each of these ESXi hosts separately so that you could see the virtual machines running on them. And there would be no communication between ESXi hosts. So I wouldn't be able to do things like do a vMotion, where I migrate a virtual machine from host to host. I also can't do things like cloning. I can't, there's all kinds of things that I can't do without vCenter. So once we build vCenter, and once again, vCenter is an application that runs in one of these virtual machines that is managed on these ESXi hosts, we have an overriding management component here. And vCenter has the ability then to access each of these ESXi hosts, bring them all together in one single inventory so that we can do all kinds of great stuff. We can aggregate their resources into clusters. We can create high availability. We can create the distributed resource scheduler. There's all kinds of great stuff that we can do, okay? Once we have vCenter managing our hosts and the virtual machines that are running on them, okay? So vCenter will direct the actions of the virtual machines and direct the actions of the hosts. vCenter, like I said, is an application. It runs on a Linux, in a Linux guest operating system. The entire thing is delivered by VMware in the form of a virtual appliance. So this virtual appliance is based on Photon OS, which is a distribution of Linux that came from VMware, actually, and it's managed by VMware. So you're going to come to VMware's website and you're going to download an ISO image. You're going to mount that ISO image into any sort of system that you'd want. You can mount it onto a Windows machine, onto a Mac, onto a Linux machine, onto your laptop or whatever. You're going to launch the installer from there. You'll point it to an ESXi host, answer a few questions through a wizard. We've got a demonstration of this coming up in the next lesson. And vCenter itself will be deployed as a virtual machine, okay? Running the Photon OS. It's got a PostgreSQL database, okay? And it's got all kinds of services that help us, that combine to run vCenter itself. Now, vCenter requires a significant amount of CPU and memory resources on your ESXi host. The amount of CPU and memory required for this will depend on the size of the inventory, meaning how many virtual machines, how many ESXi hosts will I need to manage across my entire vSphere infrastructure. The more virtual machines, the more ESXi hosts, the more networks, the more data stores, and so on, the more CPU and memory that that vCenter is going to require. And during the installer for this, it asks you, gives you kind of like a pull down. Do you want a tiny one, a small one, a medium, a large, an extra large size, those sorts of things, and you get to choose how large your vCenter will be. Now, once vCenter is up and running, you're going to notice that there are a large number of services that combine to perform all of the actions for vCenter, right? There's the vCenter server itself as a service. The vSphere client, that HTML5 web-based interface, is a service. There's a single sign-on service so that I can log into vCenter and I can log into one vCenter and see other vCenters that might be in the environment, so that I can log into vCenter and be able to manage other VMware software solutions with a single login. There's a service to centralize the management of our licenses. There's a lookup service. There's a certificate authority and a certificate store. There's a content library to help us share templates across multiple vCenter servers. There's a dump collector for our core dumps running on that might happen on ESXi. Now, when we deploy this appliance, all of these services get deployed with us, okay? And they'll start and stop based on a set of defaults, okay? Most of this stuff will run automatically, but there are some optional services that are there as well. So the architecture then looks like this. I've got an ESXi host here, and it's going to run vCenter. It runs a virtual machine that has vCenter. It's based on the Photon OS. This appliance, this vCenter appliance, is going to have all of vCenter services as well as a Postgres database. And it is then, as a piece of software, going to be pointed to all of the ESXi hosts. You'll tell vCenter, you'll give vCenter some credentials to manage those ESXi hosts, okay? So that it can manage and see all of the hosts and all of the virtual machines. Then I will come over here as a vSphere administrator, log into the vSphere client, which is one of the services that run in vCenter, so that I can see all of the stuff that vCenter is then managing. The single sign-on component is really important. Here's what will typically happen. The vCenter appliance will be deployed, and I'll log into the vSphere client, and I'll go to the management section where I will tell vCenter that I want to manage the system through Active Directory user accounts. First thing that I need to do is take my vCenter system itself and create a machine account in AD. So I'll have vCenter join Active Directory. This requires a reboot of the vCenter server. Okay? vCenter takes a little while to reboot. In my home lab environment, it takes about 15 minutes. Your mileage may vary. Okay. So vCenter becomes a member of the Active Directory domain. I can then take a an AD group and have it have the members of that group, let me try that one more time. From the beginning of the slide. Once our vCenter appliance has been deployed, I might want to have Active Directory users manage vCenter and ESXi hosts and virtual machines. The way that we do this is to start by taking our vCenter server and making it a member of the Active Directory domain. So I'll log into vCenter with my vSphere client, I'll go into the management section, and I will add vCenter to Active Directory. This is going to require a reboot of my vCenter virtual machine, just like it would require a reboot of any Windows machine as we join the Active Directory. In my lab environment, it takes me about 15 minutes to reboot vCenter, and your mileage may vary on that. Okay, so now my vCenter virtual machine is a member of the domain, and I can take an AD group with all of my vSphere administrators, and I can give it rights to manage vCenter and the environment that vCenter itself is managing. So that when a user that's a member of this Active Directory group that I choose, right, logs in, okay, those credentials will be sent off to the vCenter server, okay? vCenter server will pass them over to Active Directory. Active Directory will authenticate the user, notify vCenter server that the user has been authenticated, and vCenter server will send a SAML token. SAML stands for Security Assertion Markup Language. It's a browser token that is sent back to the user that says, I am Joe, for example, and anybody that wants to know about me, just ask and I will send you this token that says I've been authenticated against vCenter and I am Joe. Cool. So now the token is then sent back to vCenter server. I am Joe, I have certain rights within vCenter, or I have certain rights within NSX Manager, or any of the other components that we have registered within this system. Okay, and that's us using single sign-on so that we can access those systems without having to log in again. It's a very nice system. It's easy for us as administrators to then use the system without having to log in over and over and over again to each of the different components. One of the nice features of vCenter is that you can take your vCenter server and join multiple vCenter servers together in what we call enhanced link mode. Now, vCenter server is an enterprise class software component, and it can manage really large sets of infrastructure. But those sets of infrastructure are not infinite, okay? And we're going to show you a little bit of the scalability features of vCenter and how many virtual machines that it can actually manage and how many ESXi hosts. It's a really large number, right? But you might come to a point where I have these data centers all over the place. I have data centers that go beyond the scalability of a single vCenter server and so on. So I might want to take multiple vCenter servers and join them in enhanced link mode. It's an easy thing to do. All you have to do once your first vCenter is installed, you take your subsequent vCenters, you point them at the first one, and then they join a built-in LDAP domain that by default is called vsphere.local. Okay? And they actually exchange information so that when you log into one vCenter server, you can see the inventory of all of the vCenter servers that are joined together in enhanced link mode. In vCenter 7, we can support up to 15 vCenters linked together in a single sign-on domain. Okay, so this is a really nice feature of vCenter Server. Now, when it comes to communication, there are some things that you should be aware of, but for the most part, this is taken care of automatically. The most important thing for us to know as vSphere administrators is that the communication between us, a browser, and vCenter server, and vCenter server and an ESXi host, is that this communication happens over port 443 using TLS secure communications. Okay? This is similar to me going to a banking website and passing off my credentials. We know that it's secure because these credentials are encrypted, and this communication is encrypted. Doing this requires trust and certificates. So certificates and encryption are all done through certificate authorities, and certificates are delivered to the server components like vCenter server and your ESXi hosts. So we can look a little bit at how those certificates are managed, okay? But suffice it to say is that you actually have to have a certificate authority in your environment. vCenter actually can act as a certificate authority, but if you have, for example, an Active Directory CA, you can use that as well, okay? Just know that replacing self-signed certificates, which are delivered by default, is an important thing that you should do. All of these components are communicated with on port 443. Also know that if you're using lockdown mode, and you can do this a little bit later on when you actually tell you tell ESXi, hey, don't allow anybody to communicate with me except vCenter server. Then the host client becomes disabled, and SSH directly with an ESXi host becomes disabled, and vCenter is the only system that can communicate with a particular ESXi host. So how many hosts and virtual machines can I actually manage with vCenter 7? Well, we can manage up to 2,500 physical ESXi hosts with a single vCenter server. That's actually a lot. It's a lot of ESXi hosts that we can manage, right? But it certainly doesn't give us anywhere near the scope of the largest data centers that are being managed with vSphere, right? The largest data centers may be 10 or even 20 or 30, or who knows how much larger than that. In which case, we're going to use enhanced linked mode, okay? So up to 2,500 hosts with 40,000 powered on virtual machines. You can actually have up to 45,000 registered VMs with vCenter, but 40,000 it can keep track of in management, with 64 hosts in each cluster and 8,000 VMs per cluster. So that does it for us with the initial architecture of vCenter Server. Okay? We know how the ESXi hosts communicate with vCenter. We're going to look at, we've identified some of the services that are involved in vCenter. We talked a little bit about enhanced linked mode. Okay? And when we come back, we're actually going to do the installation of vCenter Server itself. We'll see you real soon.